So up to this point, we've primarily been looking at the Gothic as the point of origin for what would evolve into the weird. But the Gothic really doesn't become the weird until in the 1890s it converges with literary decadence much more directly. That sort of art for art's sake movement in England and France at the end of the 19th century, right? That elevated aesthetic experience over moral values. We'll talk a little bit in more detail in a moment about what exactly is going on there. What I want you to focus on as we talk about Oscar Wilde and this decadent fairy tale, The Fisherman and His Soul, I want you to focus on the conflict here between the use value of people and objects in the text and their aesthetic value. Right? To what extent are things useful? To what extent do they merely give pleasure? Which does the story seem to favor? All right, so let's get started. First off, this story first appears in this story first appears in a fairy tale collection called The House of Pomegranates, published in 1891. Now, this is the second collection of fairy tales that Wilde had published. The first, which contains stories like The Happy Prince and The Selfish Giant, is much more clearly aimed at children. A House of Pomegranates seems to be aimed primarily at an adult audience. Most of the other tales in the collection were originally published separately in magazines. So, much like Le Fanu's In a Glass Darkly, by and large these are tales that were not originally intended to sit next to each other. And yet, there are certain common themes that emerge in the tales in the collection, and a lot of it centers around the imagery of the pomegranate. First off, that the pomegranate, to an Anglo-Irishman like Wilde, would be an exotic fruit, right? Pomegranates don't exactly grow around Dublin, and you don't really find them occurring naturally in London either. Now, another thing about pomegranates is the comparative difficulty of consuming. How they're sort of an inverted form of fruit, right? The seeds are edible, right? The little kernels inside are edible. The flesh of the fruit, on the other hand, is not, right? Usually it's the other way around. Like, say you bite into a peach, it's the flesh, the pulp, that's edible. You can't exactly munch on a peach stone and expect anything good to happen. So this kind of inversion is symbolic of the sort of moral and ethical inversion that is often inherent in decadent art. The pomegranate also, because of the shape of its insides, is often associated with female sexuality. Also the fact that the pulp, right, the fleshy part, is a place where the seeds are sort of brought to life. Now, it also has strong associations with afterlife myths, right? Particularly the Greek mysteries of Demeter and Persephone. Right? Persephone, the daughter of the grain goddess Demeter, is kidnapped by her uncle Hades and made his bride in the underworld. Now, Zeus, the king of the gods, says that Persephone can return to the upper world provided she has tasted no food during her time in the underworld. But it turns out that she has eaten a few pomegranate seeds that have been given to her. So the pomegranate is that which ties her then to the lower world. It becomes a fruit that is sort of associated with death, right? Much as decadence is decadent artists were often accused by their critics of a kind of excessive morbidity, right? A sort of fixation on death and the process of civilizational degeneration and decay. So the Pomegranate all has something to do with that. And a lot of that is tied up in the stories in this particular collection. Now we see here, much as we saw in Carmilla, a kind of combat between the forces of the spiritual and the forces of the material. Now the forces of the spiritual don't necessarily fall along traditional lines here. Some weird alliances are made in pursuit of the spiritual. Now, the obvious representative of the spiritual is the priest, right? The fisherman comes to the priest and asks how he might be rid of his soul. And the priest beat his breast and answered, "Alack, alack, thou art mad, or hast eaten of some poisonous herb. For the soul is the noblest part of man, and was given to us by God, that we should nobly use it. There is nothing more precious than a human soul, nor any earthly thing that can be weighted with it. It is worth all the gold that is in the world, and is more precious than the rubies of the kings. Therefore, my son, think not any more of this matter, for it is a sin that may not be forgiven. And as for the sea folk, they are lost, and they who would traffic with them are lost also. They are as the beasts of the field that know not good from evil, and for them the Lord has not died." So one thing that's interesting about the soul, spoken in these terms by the priest, right, is that he focuses in some sense on its use value. He doesn't explain how you're supposed to use it, but he says it's given to you by God to use. And he places a kind of monetary value on it. It's worth all the gold that is in the world, and more precious than the rubies of the kings. So the soul for the priest has a kind of utilitarian material value. More on this in a minute, right? I just want to point this out. We'll sit on it for a second, and then we'll pick it up later. But weirdly, the priest's ally in arguing for the side of the spiritual is the witch, right? The servant of Satan himself. Right? When the fisherman tells the witch what it is he wants to do, the witch grew pale and shuddered and hid her face in her blue mantle. Pretty boy, she muttered. That is a terrible thing to do." Right? Untethering one's soul from one's body, even to the witch, is anathema. Now, one of the interesting things about the witch, right, when the fisherman first comes to him, what's the question that she asks him repeatedly over and over again? Right? What do you lack? What do you lack? The irony here is that the fisherman has not come to her to gain something. He's come to her to lose something. Right? He wants to be rid of his soul so he can go and join the mermaid. But the witch is still thinking of this transaction in terms of material gain, right? We are going to make some sort of exchange, and you're going to give me something, and you're going to get something material out of it, right? What do you lack? What do you lack? Now the fisherman tossed his brown curls and laughed. "My soul is not to me," he answered. "I cannot see it. I may not touch it. I do not know it." So because the soul to him has no obvious material existence, no material presence, at least at this stage, he seems not to barely even believe in it, right? What good is this thing doing me? All it's doing is keeping me from the thing that I love. So in what way is that useful? In what way is this thing actually any good? I don't need it. I'll be rid of it. I'll cut the spiritual off from myself and become a purely material thing, so that I can go off and be with the other purely material thing that I love. Now, decadence overall is by and large a reaction against the dominant philosophical paradigm in Britain in the 19th century, which is called utilitarianism. This here is the stuffed and mummified corpse of the father of English utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, which is currently on display at the University of London, which he helped to found. Now, utilitarianism, as per Bentham and his followers, people like James Mill and his son John Stuart Mill, rests on a few principles. First, that every idea and object in the world should be judged solely in terms of its use value. To what extent is this thing useful in either promoting pleasure or reducing pain? Right? The goal of human life, according to Bentham, is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. In fact, he even came up with a sort of mathematical formula for this that he calls the hedonic calculus. Utilitarians friggin' love math, right? Now, the end result of utilitarianism is often to sort of devalue art, particularly that art which does not have some sort of clear moral or educational purpose. Bentham wrote in an essay on poetry, for example, that prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. Now, pushpin was a sort of very simple game that people played in the 19th century. Like, the goal was to sort of push a little pin into a cup, I think. I seem to recall the rules being sort of similar to Tiddlywinks. At any rate, like, it's a game that's simple enough for a child to understand. But Bentham's argument was that pushpin could be understood and appreciated by more people than poetry could. Ergo, it brought more pleasure into the world than poetry did, and as such was more valuable. So utilitarians are this is not always true, this is sometimes an unfair characterization, particularly when you're talking about someone like John Stuart Mill, who appreciated poetry very much. But utilitarians are often regarded as being kind of anti-art, that art is a silly, frivolous, useless kind of thing. And so decadents take that and turn it into a value, right? It's good that art is silly and frivolous and useless, right? Because look at how boring and dull and gray all of you utilitarians are, sitting mummified in your glass cases, waiting for the next meeting of the trustees of the university. Yeah, that's where he sits, all right. Fun times. Now, here's how utilitarianism plays out in this particular story. We've already looked at the way the priest, the witch, and the fisherman are all looking at the soul in terms of use value, right? But there's more to it than this. For example, when the fisherman first encounters the mermaid, the thing that he notices about her is the effect of her song on all the fish around his boat. And as she sang, all the tunny fish came in from the deep to listen to her. And the young fisherman threw his nets around them and caught them, and others he took with a spear. And when his boat was well laden, the mermaid would sink down into the sea, laughing at him. Now, why is the mermaid laughing at the fisherman? It's not entirely clear, because the language here is very much the language of fairy tale, and nothing is really ever explained to us very clearly. Like, the world is presented to us, and we're just kind of supposed to accept it. We'll see something similar when we read Lord Dunsany's fairy tales. But I think what's going on here, the reason she's laughing at him, is that all he's concerned with when she appears is the effect that her song has on his ability to catch fish, right? She is a professional benefit to him. She sings her song, and it makes it easier for him to catch fish. And we see a similar thing when he goes to try to sell his soul to the merchants, right? The merchants refuse to buy. Just as the priest won't help him, the merchants also won't help him. The merchants mocked at him and said, "Of what use is a man's soul to us? It is not worth a clipped piece of silver. Sell us thy body for a slave, but talk not of the soul, for to us it is naught, nor has it any value for our service." So utilitarian values are pretty deeply baked into this story, but primarily to be overturned. Because the mermaid is presented to us as an aesthetic object. Her hair was as a wet fleece of gold, and each separate hair as a thread of fine gold in a cup of glass. Her body was as white ivory, and her tail was of silver and pearl. Silver and pearl was her tail, and the green weeds of the sea coiled round it. And like seashells were her ears, and her lips were like sea coral. The cold waves dashed over her cold breasts, and the salt glistened upon her eyelids. Gold, ivory, glass, silver, pearl. Right? She's described in terms of a sort of finely wrought object, right? A created thing. A beautiful object made out of beautiful raw materials. And she is also described as cold, right? The cold waves dashed over her cold breasts. Right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Pygmalion story from Ovid's Metamorphoses, right? The guy who falls in love with his statue. This is a very similar kind of thing, this kind of cold marble object, which the fisherman falls in love with. And over time, he becomes much more concerned with her aesthetic value than with her use value, right? At first, he just wants her to catch fish for him. But then he becomes entranced by her beauty, by her song, and he doesn't give a shit about catching fish anymore. He wants to live in the water with this beautiful thing. But because he still has a soul, a thing useful for his eternal salvation, he has to be rid of it before he can live with this object of pure art. Now, the fisherman himself, once he comes to this conclusion, is treated as an aesthetic object at the witches' Sabbath. So, a certain gentleman, whom we should all recognize, in all likelihood, right, shows up at the witches' Sabbath. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste, all that, good times. And I think it would be worth dwelling on the way he's described. It's not a traditional description of the devil. Right? It was a man dressed in a suit of black velvet, cut in the Spanish fashion. His face was strangely pale, but his lips were like a proud red flower. He seemed weary, and was leaning back, toying in a listless manner with the pommel of his dagger. On the grass beside him lay a plumed hat, and a pair of riding gloves, gauntleted with gilt lace, and sewn with seed pearls wrought into a curious device. A short cloak lined with sables hung from his shoulder, and his delicate white hands were gemmed with rings. Heavy eyelids drooped over his eyes. The young fisherman watched him as one snared in a spell. At last their eyes met. and wherever he danced, it seemed to him that the eyes of the man were upon him. He heard the witch laugh, and caught her by the waist, and whirled her madly round and round. Suddenly a dog bayed in the wood, and the dancers stopped, and going up 2 by 2, knelt down and kissed the man's hand. As they did so, a little smile touched his proud lips, as a bird's wing touches the water and makes it laugh. But there was disdain in it. He kept looking at the young fisherman. Now, most critics of this text regard the depiction here of the devil as a kind of depiction of the aristocratic aesthetic dandy, right? He's elaborately dressed in a kind of archaic fashion, and he sits in borderline disinterested contemplation of the fisherman as a beautiful thing to watch, right? He makes no motion towards the fisherman. He merely watches. So a lot of these same critics argue that this is a reference to decadent homosexual practices, particularly the attraction of several decadent artists, Wilde himself included, to much younger men. And in fact, Wilde had himself photographed in poses and in costumes that look very, very similar to the way he describes the devil in this particular text. But I think the point here, the key here, is the boredom, the disdain, the distance between the devil as connoisseur and the fisherman as object. It would probably be worth talking here about the dance motif in the story as well, right? Dance, whether with the witch or the dancing girls in the city that the soul lures the fisherman to, seems to be an important symbol here. So when the fisherman goes to the witch and requests her help, he asks, "What then shall I give thee?" he cried, "if thy price be neither gold nor silver?" The witch stroked his hair with her thin white hand. "Thou must dance with me, pretty boy," she murmured, and she smiled at him as she spoke. "Naught but that?" cried the young fisherman in wonder, and he rose to his feet. "Naught but that," she answered, and she smiled at him again. Now it's clear that this dance request, right, even though all they literally do at the witch's Sabbath is dance, she's not really asking them to dance, right? That's not really the point here. What this is a kind of seduction scene. This is not merely...
Hi.
Hello. Sorry.
Was it already unlocked?
Pardon?
Was the door already unlocked?
Yeah. Oh, no, I unlocked it. Yep.
I'm just locking it for the storm day.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, where were we, right? So yeah, the dance here is clearly a seduction, right? What she's asking for is the fisherman's... Well, she is asking for the fisherman's love in a sense, right? She is upset that he prefers the mermaid to her, right? She says at various points that he should have been mine. But this seems to be what she's trying to use to lure him away from his purpose. And my evidence for this is the second time that the dance motif appears. Now, when the young fisherman heard the words of his soul, he remembered that the little mermaid had no feet and could not dance. And a great desire came over him, and he said to himself, "It is but a day's journey, and I can return to my love." And he laughed, and stood up in the shallow water, and strode towards the shore. Now, I think it's worth remembering here what else the mermaid does not have. Right? The lower half of her body is all fishy. Right? It's a tail. So the fisherman and the mermaid cannot actually have sex. So I think that the soul is using the temptation of sex to lure the fisherman out of the water and to bring the two back together. What association the soul has with sex, I'm not quite sure. I'm still working that out. That might actually be something that you might try to tease out in your response papers, your discussion board posts, right? That might be a sort of fruitful area of discussion here. Suffice to say, there's clearly some kind of connection there. To me, anyway. Now, the way this ends is also particularly ambiguous. The fisherman and the mermaid both die, right? The fisherman sees the mermaid's funeral come up onto the shore, and then he himself dies after being reunited with his soul. And in the morning, while it was still dawn, the priest who had condemned them went forth with the monks and the musicians and the candle-bearers and the swingers of censers and a great company, and came to the shore of the sea and blessed the sea and all the wild things that are in it. The fawns also he blessed, and the little things that dance in the woodland, and the bright-eyed things that peer through the leaves. All the things in God's world he blessed, and the people were filled with joy and wonder. Yet never again in the corner of the fuller's field grew flowers of any kind, but the field remained barren even as before. Nor came the sea folk into the bay as they had been wont to do, for they went to another part of the sea. So the priest has been moved by the beauty of some purple flowers that have appeared over the grave in which the fisherman and the mermaid are buried. And this has moved him to abandon the kind of sterility of his previous position on fisherman-mermaid relations, and to go out and bless all of these creatures that he had before condemned as soulless, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that these flowers are a one-time growth, right? There's one little stab of beauty that comes out of the earth as a result of the fisherman and the mermaid's relationship, and then nothing else. The field remains barren as before from then on. I think that what that is pointing to is decadent art's celebration of ephemeral moments of beauty, right? That beauty is something that catches our eye and can't last, right? It has to decay. It has to die. So we have to kind of squeeze that last little bit of sweetness out of a piece of fruit that is slowly rotting. The other thing that's particularly interesting here is the priest's change in attitude towards all these creatures of fantasy. Now, Jarlath Colleen, who is probably the leading scholar on the Irish Gothic, has written about this. And he notes a particularly Irish context for what's going on here. Right, in the 1840s, Ireland was devastated by a series of potato blights. Right, in several years successively, the potato crop failed, and thousands of people died or emigrated as a result. Now, one of the effects that this potato blight had was to kill off the earlier form of sort of folk religion in Ireland, which was a kind of Catholicism often blended with elements of paganism, right? Belief in holy wells, in the thorn as a fairy tree, right? In fairies and creatures of that nature generally. And it was replaced by a very kind of strict, austere Catholicism that was based primarily on maintaining rigid sexual morality. So, for Colleen, the mermaids and the fauns and these fantasy creatures represent that earlier folk religion, and the priest, the much more formalized religion with no time for fantasy that replaces them. So what we have here at the end of the story is this more formal Catholicism coming to terms with its roots in folk religion. And here we have another picture of the fisherman catching the mermaid. This is from the first British edition of the book. Right, so next time when we look at The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, we are going to be seeing much more directly where decadence and the Gothic merge their streams into the weird. So I only want you to read the first 4 stories in the collection. Right, so just The Repairer of Reputations, The Mask, In the Court of the Dragon, and The Yellow Sign. Don't worry about the rest. So these first 4 stories are all connected by the use of a fictional play called The King in Yellow as a plot device. So from what we're given in the text, what can we determine about this play, and what role does it play in the stories themselves, right? How does the play actually function in this kind of longer 4-story arc? Also, I want you to pay close attention to the near future society that Chambers sets up at the beginning of The Repairer of Reputations. Right? He kind of sets up a hyper-rational authoritarian state. And how does it provide a backdrop, first for Hildred Castaing's ravings in that story, and also for the situations that occur in the later stories? Third, what can we tell about the implied listener or listeners as we read the tales told by Chambers' feverish narrators? What assumptions do the narrators seem to make about their audience, right? It's probably difficult to infer specific listeners in these stories, right? Who specifically they're being told to. But we can probably draw some conclusions about what sort of person is listening to these stories. And finally, think about the role that churches play, particularly in the last 2 tales. All right, so that does it for Oscar Wilde. We'll see you next time.